I'd like to talk to you about gauge and tension. Now, what is what? Because you might hear these terms a lot when you crochet. Now, gauge is another word for size. A certain number of stitches and rows give you a certain size. That's gauge. So how is this determined? If you have a centimeter, like you have row gauges and stitch gauges. So let's look at stitch gauge. So here you have a number of stitches that worked in this way, and you have rows and they're here stacked on top of each other. So stitch gauge is, for example, usually it's given in terms of 10 centimeters. So within 10 centimeters there should be a certain number of stitches if you're working to gauge, as it's called. So that means you literally put your tape measure down and you count how many stitches are there in that 10 centimeters. So here you see the start of the stitch, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I have 13 stitches here in these 10 centimeters. Now the pattern, if you need to work to gauge, will state how many stitches there should be within this 10 centimeters, and then you know whether you're right or wrong with your gauge. Likewise, you also have a row gauge. So that's how many rows are there in the stitch pattern for a certain number of centimeters. Usually the pattern will say 5 rows in 10 centimeters, for example. Now I haven't worked 10 centimeters here, but for example, if I look at 2 rows, these are 2 rows, and I look what's the gauge on that? That's 2.5 centimeters. So it's an inch on 2 rows. So that would be a way to say what the gauge is for this specific pattern that I've worked here. If I were to describe it, I would say row gauge is 2 rows is 2.5 centimeters, 10 centimeters is 13 stitches. So that's gauge. Gauge is how many stitches and how many rows are a certain dimension. Tension, on the other hand, is how tight you pull your yarn. And to a certain degree, what hook size you're using. And how tight you pull your yarn and what hook you use influences your gauge. So you can pull this yarn tight or you can leave it loose, and that will influence what your fabric looks like in regards to size. So tension influences gauge. And gauge is important when you're working garments, clothing, you want that to fit. But when you're working blankets, it's usually not that critical. It'll only mean that if your gauge is off, that you might use more or less yarn, and that your blanket will be larger or smaller than indicated in the pattern. But especially for garments, gauge is important. So gauge you can influence by changing hook size and by changing your tension, the way you pull your yarn. And I'll upload a second video specifically about this tension, and that's called the golden loop. So look for that video if you're interested in that. But for now, the take-home message is gauge is how large is your fabric. So how many stitches and how many rows gives you how many centimeters, and tension is how tight you pull your yarn.